The story of the Second World War doesn't begin with tanks crossing a border. It begins in the suffocating silence of November 11th, 1918. When the guns finally fell silent on the Western Front, Germany was not a defeated nation in the eyes of its soldiers. They were still standing on foreign soil. This gave birth to the Dolchstoß legend, the stab-in-the-back myth. Soldiers returning home felt betrayed by the politicians and revolutionaries in Berlin. Among these bitter men was a former corporal, Adolf Hitler. The 1920s in Germany were a nightmare. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the nation of its pride, its land, and its money. Hyperinflation was so severe that people carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. In this chaos, Hitler and his National Socialist Party found fertile ground. He wasn't just a politician, he was a voice for the humiliated. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the fragile Weimar Republic collapsed. Hitler used the burning of the Reichstag in 1933 to seize total power, transforming a democracy into a cult of personality. He didn't just want to rebuild Germany, he wanted to avenge it. While the world looked away, Hitler rebuilt his war machine. In May 1940, he turned it against France. The world expected a repeat of the bloody stalemate of World War I, but the Germans had a different plan, Case Yellow. The French High Command sat confidently behind the Maginot Line, believing the Ardennes forest to the north was impassable for tanks. General Erich von Manstein proposed a daring Sickle cut. While the Allies rushed north to defend Belgium, the German panzer divisions, led by commanders like Rommel and Guderian, smashed through the impassable Ardennes. It was a tactical masterpiece. The Allied armies were cut off, their communication lines severed. In a matter of days, the greatest land power in Europe was in a state of total collapse. By late May, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. Hitler, for reasons still debated by historians, ordered his tanks to halt. This halt order gave the British a narrow window. Between May 26th and June 4th, a flotilla of over 800 little ships, fishing boats, yachts, and lifeboats braved the Luftwaffe's bombs to rescue 338,000 soldiers. France fell weeks later, and as Hitler danced a jig in Paris, Britain stood alone, a small island facing a continent of darkness. On June 22, 1941, Hitler unleashed the largest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and an entire air force surged across a 2,000-mile front into the Soviet Union. This wasn't a traditional war, it was a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation between fascism and communism. Hitler's strategy was to encircle and destroy the Red Army near the borders. At first, it seemed he would succeed. In the massive pockets of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in weeks. The German panzers moved so fast that the Soviet command was in a state of paralysis. But as they drove deeper, the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, arrived. The roads turned into swamps. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. By the time the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow in December, the temperature plummeted to -40 degrees. The Wehrmacht, unequipped for a winter campaign, began to freeze. Then came the counterattack. From the depths of the east, Marshal Zhukov unleashed the Siberian divisions. These were fresh winter-hardened troops equipped with the T-34 tank, a machine far superior to anything the Germans had at the time. The Blitzkrieg had finally met its match in the vast, frozen heart of Russia. While Europe was drowning in blood, a different kind of storm was gathering in the east. Imperial Japan, driven by a desperate need for oil and rubber to fuel its war in China, felt the noose of U.S. economic sanctions tightening around its neck. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who understood the industrial might of America better than any of his peers, proposed a gamble that would either win the war in a day or doom his empire forever. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Kido Butai, the elite Japanese carrier strike force, launched 353 planes from 6 carriers. They struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. The tactical surprise was total. Within minutes, the battleship Roe was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that it shook the entire harbor, taking 1,177 sailors with it to the bottom. But Yamamoto's fear was realized. While the battleships were burning, the American aircraft carriers were out at sea. Japan had struck a blow, but they had failed to cut the heart out of the American fleet. They had only awakened a sleeping giant. In early 1942, Japan was the master of the Pacific, but Admiral Nimitz and his codebreakers at Station Hypo were about to change that. In a damp basement in Hawaii, Joseph Rochefort and his team worked tirelessly to crack the JN-25 code. They discovered a strike was planned for a target labeled AF. Through a brilliant ruse, sending a fake message about a water shortage, they confirmed that AF was the tiny atoll of Midway. On June 4, 1942, the two fleets met. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carriers, faced an impossible choice. His scout reports were confusing and delayed. He ordered his planes to be rearmed from torpedoes to bombs, and then back again. This left the Japanese carrier decks, Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi, cluttered with fueled planes, unsecured bombs, and tangled hoses. At 10:22 a.m., the tide of history turned. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Wade McCluskey, spotted the Japanese fleet. In just 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed into floating infernos. It was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. If Midway was a duel of carriers, Guadalcanal was a brutal 6-month test of endurance. It was the first American offensive of the war, centered around a small airstrip called Henderson Field. For the Marines on the ground, it was a descent into a nightmare of malaria, dysentery, and banzai charges in the pitch-black jungle. The naval battles in the Iron Bottom Sound were just as savage. During the night of the Battle of Savo Island, the U.S. Navy suffered its worst blue water defeat in history, but the Americans refused to leave. On land at Bloody Ridge, a handful of Marines held out against waves of Japanese infantry. This was where the Japanese military first learned that their spirit could not overcome the sheer firepower and grit of the American industry. By the time Japan evacuated the island in February 1943, they had lost not just an island, but the cream of their experienced pilots and soldiers. The long road to Tokyo had begun. By late 1942, the world's attention was fixed on a single city on the banks of the Volga River, Stalingrad. This was no longer a military objective. It had become a personal duel between Hitler and Stalin. The German Sixth Army, led by Friedrich Paulus, had fought its way into the city, but they found themselves in a nightmare. In the ruins of factories and apartment blocks, the Soviet defenders followed the order, not a step back. The combat was so close and so brutal that it was called Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Every room, every basement, and every sewer pipe was a battlefield. But while the Germans were bled white in the city, the Soviet Red Army was preparing a massive trap. On November 19, 1942, they launched Operation Uranus. In a massive pincer movement, they smashed through the weak Romanian and Italian flanks, surrounding 250,000 German soldiers in a Kessel, a cauldron. Hitler, refusing to admit defeat, ordered Paulus to stand his ground, promising an air bridge that never delivered enough food or fuel. As the Russian winter descended, the Sixth Army began to starve and freeze to death. When Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, it was the greatest defeat in German history. The tide in the east had turned for good. While the Soviet steamroller began its long march toward Berlin, the Western Allies were preparing for the most complex military operation ever conceived, Operation Overlord. Hitler had spent years building the Atlantic Wall, a series of concrete bunkers, minefields, and steel obstacles stretching from Norway to Spain. To break this wall, the Allies needed more than just ships. They needed silence and lies. Through Operation Fortitude, the Allies created a massive deception. They built a ghost army of inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter to convince Hitler that the invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. The ruse worked perfectly. Even as the sun rose on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Hitler remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a mere distraction. Across 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, over 150,000 Allied troops stormed the shores. At Omaha Beach, the Americans faced a literal wall of fire from German MG-42s, earning it the name Bloody Omaha. But by the end of the day, the Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. By late 1944, the Third Reich was being squeezed in a giant vice. To the east, the Soviets had launched Operation Bagration, destroying the German Army Group Center. To the west, the Allies were racing toward the Rhine. In a desperate last-ditch gamble, Hitler launched the Battle of the Bulge in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. He hoped to split the Allied lines and force a peace treaty. For a moment, the line bulged, but the courage of the American paratroopers at Bastogne held the gate shut. The gamble failed, and the German army's last reserves were spent. The final chapter was written in the rubble of Berlin. In April 1945, the Red Army surrounded the city. The fighting was fanatical. Old men and young boys were forced into the streets to face Soviet tanks. Deep underground in his Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler realized the end had come. On April 30th, as Soviet shells shook the ceiling above him, he committed suicide. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted only 12 years, leaving a continent in ruins and a legacy of horror that would haunt the world forever. While the guns fell silent in Europe, the Pacific was screaming with a different kind of fury. The United States had begun its island-hopping campaign, moving closer and closer to the Japanese home islands, but as they drew nearer, the resistance became more fanatical. In early 1945, the Marines landed on a volcanic speck of dust called Iwo Jima. The Japanese had spent months turning the island into a subterranean fortress. There were no banzai charges here. Instead, there was a silent, deadly wait in tunnels and caves. Every inch of the island was paid for in American blood. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi was a symbol of hope, but the reality was a month of brutal attrition where nearly the entire Japanese garrison fought to the death. This was followed by Okinawa, the last stepping stone to Japan. It was the largest sea-land-air battle in history. Here, the world witnessed the full terror of the kamikaze, suicide pilots who turned their planes into human missiles. On the ground, the Typhoon of Steel claimed over 200,000 lives, including thousands of civilians. The sheer scale of the carnage at Okinawa sent a chilling message to Washington. An invasion of the Japanese mainland would cost 1 million American lives. In the summer of 1945, President Harry Truman faced a decision that would haunt human history forever. In the secret laboratories of the Manhattan Project, scientists had unlocked the power of the atom. On July 16th, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. The world had entered the nuclear age, but nobody yet knew what that truly meant. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay flew over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb, Little Boy, was dropped. In a flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, the city was erased. Tens of thousands vanished in a heartbeat. Tens of thousands more would suffer from the black rain of radiation. 3 days later, when Japan still hesitated to surrender, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The power of the sun had been brought down to Earth, and the message was clear: surrender or face total annihilation. The shock of the atomic bombs, combined with a massive Soviet invasion of Manchuria, finally broke the will of the Japanese hardliners. On August 15th, the people of Japan heard the voice of their Emperor Hirohito for the first time. In a crackling radio broadcast, he announced that Japan would endure the unendurable and surrender. The formal end came on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Under the watchful eyes of General Douglas MacArthur and representatives from the Allied nations, the Japanese delegation signed the Instrument of Surrender. The deadliest conflict in human history, a war that had claimed over 60 million lives and reshaped the map of the world, was finally over. But the peace was fragile. The ruins of Berlin and Tokyo were already being overshadowed by a new, colder conflict between the East and the West. The Second World War had ended, but it had left behind a world divided by iron curtains and the looming threat of nuclear fire. The survivors looked out at a landscape of ash and hope, knowing that humanity could never again afford a war like the Great Cataclysm of 1939 to 1945.